How DLV delicious people. I'm here today to review Batman and Robin. So, I never thought that I would actually go out of my way to review this movie. Just because I don't know, I didn't know if anyone would actually care about a review of this. Because really, a lot of times, quite obviously, a lot of people would just have negative things to say about this film and how actually it's quite possibly the worst Batman film to ever put out there. Well, honestly, when looking at this movie, I actually found this movie fun to watch. Yeah, there are at some points in times some Looney Tune like sounds that are to be placed within this movie, like the banana slip fall, like we end up having these like bizarrish like sound effects that get in place within this movie that kind of gives this movie a very Looney Tune-ish like look, or really is much more kind of a familiar territory of like a mask kind of movie delivery, or like something that also feels very much like trying to appeal to kids much more so than an adult audience. Going into this film, I'm going to try as much as possible to put some positives into this film while also just like being and truly having an honest opinion about this film. Really, I could say that Bane, as well as Poison Ivy, it really tells you where these characters at this time period were, and how I think much more now, both Bane and Poison Ivy have been much more changed to be much more important characters. Looking at Poison Ivy in a comic book now, like I'm actually like, ooh, like this story is actually exciting. Where Poison Ivy would go and quite possibly kiss someone and have that person eventually become Poison Ivy's zombie-esh like slave, where in this movie we end up having Poison Ivy just being a one-note thing, which is to blow away some pheromone dust to get people to do whatever she wants. Of course, doesn't work on everyone, but it just works on most. I don't know how many numerous times that Poison Ivy just sploos, spladoos this whole dust thing, especially onto both Robin and Batman. Like, how much does this dust thing just not work out? Like, how many times does a Poison Ivy have to blow into someone to have control over them? Like, I thought that that was kind of bizarre in this movie. We have it to where Bane in this film kind of just represents a giant luchadorish like wrestler. Like obviously his gear looks just like wrestling gear to me. To where obviously I think the guy that actually was to be casted in this movie was just some wrestler that was to be casted to be Bane at that time. Going into this movie, like you could really tell like how like really and truly like man, like for this time, like these were the best you could do for these certain characters. Whereas you can see in like Christian Bale, like Bane is way more intimidating, way more important, and really has a lot more to say than comedy. Like he's a very one note guy where he barely says anything. Uh, Here's also the funny thing. So we end up having ice that in this movie is seemingly a way to break through anything. Like man, uh, if you have like the hardest stone, but if you just shoot ice into it, you can just break through anything. It's kind of interesting to see how that just kind of plays out in this film, where it's like if you just put ice through anything, you can break through anything in this movie almost. With the exclusion, maybe reinforced steel, not good. So, going into this film, I find this movie overall to be a fun adventure. Really, this movie is actually worth watching compared to some even other Batman films that come much later, like the Batman and Superman film. Really, with this film, I feel like this movie is going on into very familiar territory, whereas the Superman and Batman movie, every time I go into that, I'm like, I don't remember this movie at all. Like, every single time I go into this movie, I'm like, oh, okay, I remember all these notes. I remember what's all going on with here. Because I honestly think a movie like that is just a jumbled mess that you don't remember anything of that movie. Whereas this one, like, you remember the beats, you remember the notes, you remember what's going on in this film for the most part. So, going on into this, really, I would say that the villains in this story are honestly a copy and paste of Batman Returns. It's kind of obvious. We have it to where really Poison Ivy is just a copy of Catwoman, and Mr. Freeze is actually just a blatant copy of almost Penguin, a person who had lost a family member and he wants to get them back. Kind of like Penguin, who had lost his parents and is trying to search and try to get back to them but never can. Kind of almost the same, similar kind of thing. We have in this movie, funny enough, Mr. Freeze isn't running for mayor in this film, or maybe governor. Anyways, really, I know the jokes are kind of lame in this film, but I honestly just find them fun. The only thing that I thought was like really goofy is when Batman ends up kind of like sliding into scene on top of that dinosaur. I thought that was kind of really goofy. I'm like, why did you have to do that? And why would you spend the money or whatever to be able to perfect Batman sliding down a dinosaur? That looks just really weird. For some people that could also like the Batman cartoons and like Batman Brave and the Bold, or even quite possibly the Adam West Batman 60 series. Like, I think who liked those would also like this movie. And I think really when I was watching that film, or watching this film, I mean, like I was watching this thinking of those things to just be like, oh, okay, like this is kind of like the Batman Brave and the Bold kind of style, or just like just the really just a goofy style that I could just eventually get into. Like, it wasn't something where I was like, man, this just feels so weird compared to all the other Batman films. It's not it like, because I just recently just reviewed Batman Returns, and so when going into this film, like, I was just like, yeah, so it's a different style. So what? It's a different approach. So what? It's just like trying to also copy off of the color style of the movie that came before, Batman Forever, while they were trying to inject as much color as humanly possible into this film. Really, also, I did enjoy how we were starting to see a story of Robin really wanting to fly on his own, and how it seems that we actually have uh, really a real true separation of these characters, to where kind of in the Batman Forever film, it seems like Bruce Wayne and Batman are so intertwined with one another. Like, it's kind of nice to see this breakup and to also see Batgirl, who is put into this movie. A lot of people could say that Alicia Silverstone probably was a bad Batgirl. I would honestly say that, you know what? I honestly think that she was a great Batgirl. I just think that, in all honesty, she was not put into the best story. So, we end up having a girl who ends up coming from college and coming into the fray of Alfred to try to take care of him because supposedly he is sick. That has got to be the one story that I honestly hate out of all the other Batmans, is the Alfred is sick story. That has got to be the worst because like you're just like feeling bad for Alfred in this entire film. Like if anything, whenever you're seeing Alfred in a frame, you're just like, oh man, I feel bad for Alfred. To where like it just makes me feel bad for this film. That has got to be like the worst story to be put into a Batman film is Alfred is sick. Just because you're like come on, Alfred. You can do it, buddy. Like, I don't like the Alfred is sick story. And to have that be put into a movie kind of ruins this movie at certain parts, but overall, like I would just say, but yeah, but I do like these goofy action sequences, and I do like these just kind of like these like bizarrish villains that are seemingly over exaggerated, as well as the heroes are. Like everything is just overly exaggerated. Plus, we also have Clooney throughout this entire film when he is Bruce Wayne having to struggle consistently with this, like, hey, like, shouldn't you get married to the girl that you're with in this film? Really pushing on the strings of, like, well, I guess they have to really pull at George Clooney's commitment issues to write that into this film. It seems that they tried as much as possible to tie into some actual things of these people's way of doing things into this movie, but I think the whole commitment thing with both Bruce and Julie was a little bit too much. Plus, also, I think Julie kind of suffered in this movie as being Bruce Wayne's lover because it kind of feels like if you kind of took those scenes out with Julie really having much to do in this movie, like it doesn't matter. Really, we could just have it to where Bruce Wayne is seeing Poison Ivy come to the fray, and really that's all that really mattered. Because Julie, like sadly enough, like just doesn't. She does nothing for the story. She doesn't. Like, there's nothing that. Plus, also, I thought it was kind of weird that we have a telescope doing what it does towards the end of this film. Like, I didn't think a telescope could be done the way that this telescope is done. Maybe some scientists could probably poke out the inaccuracies of this film and let me know that, yeah, like a lot of this doesn't make sense. Like, a lot of it doesn't actually, there's not an actual real thing for that. But anyways, yeah, I found this movie to be fun. So for this one, I think it's about time to go into spoiler talk for this movie because I'm going to try to get as much of this movie as quickly as humanly possible done, reviewed, and out. So without a doubt, let's go into the coveted double 5 time territory to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil Batman and Robin. So in the very beginning of this film, we end up having both Bruce and Dick going into their respective costumes. Bizarrely, we end up seeing a lot of butt and crotch shots, and I don't know why. Like, why do they have to show that often? Like, the consistent, like, pushing up the costume, butt suits, and all kinds of things. A lot of people would probably goofily complain about, like, yeah, this is the nipple movie. I honestly am just like, you know what? Like, the only nipples that I think really needed to be shown was either Uma Thurman's or Alicia Silverstone's, and I think that's about it. So, going in, yeah, women. For me, honestly, maybe for some of the ladies out there also, they're like, yeah, I would have liked to. So pushing on. So going into this movie, we end up having, of course, the guys getting prepared to get to go out for the night. We end up having, of course, the Batmobile coming up, and we have, of course, Robin mentioning it's like, I want a car. Chicks dig the car because, of course, if you remember in Batman Forever, Robin was actually going into the car and driving it out to town, and everybody was just jazzed about Batman being there until eventually Robin is to come on out. And they're like, hey, that's not Batman. Coincidentally, they also have seemingly neon-colored thugs in this movie. And I'm like, what is it? Like, they had neon thugs in the other films, so in the sequel, they have to have some kind of neon thugs in this movie. So we have it to where, since Robin is oogling and ogling over the Batmobile, we have it to where Batman, of course, is like, this is why Superman works alone. So we have Batman who ends up getting the Batmobile. We end up having Robin who ends up getting into his motorcycle. We have Robin who mentions to Alfred, it's like, hey, don't wait up, Al. And he's like, I'll cancel the pizzas. And we have both of them drive off to eventually see Alfred, who is starting to feel, I'm like, no! Edit that part out of the movie. Like, only show Alfred as, like, this cool, suave-looking mother trucker. I don't want to see Alfred just, I'm feeling sick. No! Alfred is the coolest cucumber in the Batman story. You can't show him look bad. No. So, we have it to where Batman is on his Batmobile, hearing from Commissioner Gordon that there seems to be a new villain on the loose named Mr. Freeze. So, we have Bruce, who is going to some museum where Mr. Freeze is trying to, of course, get a diamond, a giant diamond the size of your hand. And so we have Mr. Freeze, who is going on to freeze up some of the security guards in this museum. And so we end up having, of course, as per usual, Batman and Robin breaking through the roof of this building because there's some glass window thing to eventually slide down the dinosaur to get to Mr. Freeze. So we have this scrambling consistently of Mr. Freeze's weapon to where eventually it gets kicked out of his hands to where eventually we have Mr. Freeze using some kind of trick to get the weapon back into his hands. And so while we have that, we end up having Batman and Robin on ice, where we have, of course, Batman and Robin who click their heels together to get ice skates come from out of their boots, bizarrely, as if they were like, yeah, like, I guess since we're fighting Mr. Freeze, I guess we need, like, ice skates. So they click their heels together and CGI skates come onto their feet. So we have both Batman and Robin. We have Batman who is going after Mr. Freeze. We have Robin who is going after the diamond. So we eventually have it to where Robin is eventually getting, kind of jockeying some of these Mr. Freeze henchmen. And eventually he ends up getting the diamond. And so we eventually have Robin who's like, well, I got mine, where's yours? So we have eventually Mr. Freeze who ends up going into his vehicle that eventually bizarrely turns into some rocket. So we end up having Batman who follows Mr. Freeze into this rocket. And so Mr. Freeze ends up freezing both of Batman's hands onto this rocket. And so we have Mr. Freeze's rocket going higher and higher and higher. And so Mr. Freeze is to tell Batman, like, hey, like, your heart will freeze, Batman. We also have it to where Robin had latched himself onto this rocket by some magnets. And so he's trying to make his way into the rocket. So we have this, of course, rocket getting higher and higher and higher. And we eventually have Robin who ends up opening one of these doors to this rocket to eventually defrost Batman's hands and eventually try and get to Mr. Freeze. But we end up having Mr. Freeze going and ejecting out of this rocket, and he ends up having these wings of sorts come out of his sides. So we end up having Batman who ends up placing a bat bomb and then they end up going and using two of these doors as some surfboard to just kind of ride their way down back to where Mr. Freeze is. We eventually end up having Batman getting so close to Mr. Freeze that he is to grab on to Mr. Freeze, and Mr. Freeze detaches his wings. So Batman has kind of a very difficult time making his way to continue to get to Mr. Freeze. Mr. Freeze goes and uses his freezing gun to slow himself down to a descent to the ground. So we eventually have this chase into this bizarrish factory to where we eventually have Mr. Freeze, who is at a stopping point. After being chased by Batman and Robin, we end up having Mr. Freeze, who is at a stopping point, and we have eventually Robin, who ends up running to go and grab at Mr. Freeze, and Mr. Freeze ends up freezing Robin in place, and Robin is still holding the diamond, so Mr. Freeze grabs the diamond and mentions to Batman, well, here's the problem with you, Batman. Like, there's always some kind of dilemma. You can either come and chase after me, or you can thaw the bird. What do you want to do? Because Mr. Freeze ends up going and sealing up a hole that he had made and escapes, and Batman decides to unthaw Robin. So we go on to eventually having Dr. Eisley's story. So we are to have Dr. Eisley, who is Poison Ivy, or Pamela Eisley, who is to have a recording being done mentioning that her progress on her experiments is kind of going really slow right now, because it seems Dr. Jason Woodrow is consistently stealing a lot of her venom samples to concoct his experiment in his wing of this place that she is in. We eventually have Dr. Pamela Eisley, who is to end up going and opening this door of which Dr. Jason Woodrow is doing his experiment on to see what he is up to, because she is curious. We have Woodrow, who is to have a lot of bidders and a lot of people going and bidding on some super warrior, super soldier warrior-esh-like thing. We have Woodrow, who is to be using every single little bit of this venom to concoct this creation of this soldier, and he is to call this soldier Bane. We end up having a very skinny guy eventually go onto this table, very Frankenstein-esque, to eventually become this very hugely muscle-bound guy. And so we end up having Woodrow, who ends up slapping this trigger on Bane to give people a sample of what Bane does. So we have Bane, who starts to break free from these shackles, and so we have people that are trying to stall him from escaping, and so they are to be taken down. So we have eventually Bane, who completely breaks out of his chains and just kind of flexes his muscles and so we eventually have Woodrow notice that Pamela Eisley is watching this this experiment and watching this whole thing. We have Woodrow pushing Eisley back into her wing of her experiments, and we have Woodrow who's like, well, like, I'm sorry that you ended up seeing that, and we have Pamela who's like, you monster! Uh, and so we have Woodrow who's like, well, like, you know what? Like, yeah, this looks bad, but, like, believe me, like, if anything, we desperately needed, like, the funding. We desperately needed to find the money to get together to make this experiment possible because we were just running out of funds. So, if anything, like, Woodrow was trying to ask Pamela, well, you know what? How about you and I just work together and maybe even be more than that? Maybe we'll be lovers or whichever. And so we have Pamela who's like, I wouldn't I wouldn't work for you if you were the last man on earth kind of thing. And so we have Woodrow who's like, well, sadly, I don't like rejection, and so you have to die. And so we have Woodrow. God, Glover is so good. I enjoy Glover. If you guys have seen him on Smallville as Lex Luthor's father, or any number of other things like Gremlins or Scrooge, or I love Glover. He's such a good actor. I wish he would have done a lot more projects. I think he's in Fear of the Walking Dead right now. But anyways, so we have Glover, who ends up taking Pamela and just basically shoving her and toppling her over like all of her experiments to where all of her experiments just end up combining together into this black hole of poisons and toxins and plant-like things, to where we have Pamela just gets sucked into this this hole, and we end up having Woodrow mention to Pamela, it's like, well, yeah, let all the poisons and the toxins just take you in and and send you on your way. And so immediately after that, we end up having Woodrow, who is to continue back to his bidders and to his money making scheme. And so we eventually have Pamela Eisley, who is eventually going to be resurrected from all of this poisons and toxins and whatever. And we eventually have Woodrow, who is confirming a bid on Bane. And so we have Woodrow, who notices Pamela, who's like, wow, Pamela, you look very different. Like, you look hot. You look amazing. And so we have Dr. Pamela Eisley, who goes on and, like, you just see these two, they're just kind of like, Woodrow is just entranced. It's like, and we have eventually Pamela explaining everything, and she also explains that what all these things had done for her body, and that eventually she ends up explaining that her lips are filled with venom. And so we have Woodrow, who ends up kissing onto Pamela, not realizing that he had received the kiss of death, and he keels over and dies. So we have, of course, Pamela now wanting to basically say that she is going to start again and basically become Mother Nature, so that way she can protect all of her plants and be able to save the world. So we push on to have also Mr. Freeze being at home watching some old some old claymation movie. Me, Mr. Icicle, and we have it to where, like, Mr. Freeze is desperately asking everyone to sing. We end up having Misbehave going and trying to get with Mr. Freeze, and we have Mr. Freeze who's like, well, no, I'm only with one gal and one gal alone. Which is Nora. So I think we eventually have Mr. Freeze, who is to really kind of look over his diamonds and to uh, try to assess, like, God, one more diamond, my love, and we'll be complete. We'll eventually have uh, Gotham frozen over to where Mr. Freeze can get the millions that he needs to be able to get his funding to revive Nora. So pushing on, so we have Barbara, who is to come into the fray uh, of this movie and be Batgirl. Like, I'm assessing or assuming it's not Barbara Gordon in this movie, but it's, I guess, maybe Barbara Pennyworth. I'm assuming. I didn't know I didn't check into the cast of things. So we have Barbara, who is to appear at Wayne Manor, and it seems that Alfred was actually supposed to get the door, but he didn't. And so we have it to where Alfred is like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the door," and Bruce Wayne is like, "Well, like, that's okay, Alfred. Like, it's the first time in like 100 years, but like, hey, mistakes can happen." This is kind of really the telltale signs of Bruce Wayne saying that Alfred is sick or dying, because eventually we have Bruce Wayne who mentions uh, to Dick, he's like, I can tell, like, I know, I've been with Alfred so long, like, I can tell exactly. So we have Bruce and everybody just going to the door to have Barbara greet them at this door, telling that she is a girl who had gone to Alfred's alma mater and that she's going to stay here for some kind of break. I think we end up finding out that Barbara had actually been kicked out of that school, and she is just coming up with a reason for her to stay here for a while. So we also end up having Barbara, who ends up noticing Dick's motorcycle, where she's like, "Oh, that looks beautiful," and so we have Barbara who mentions that, like, she's deathly terrified of a motorcycle, but we actually know the truth. So we actually know this movie. Come on. So we have it to where Bruce and Dick are mentioning to, like, I think I'm just gonna call him Grayson. We have Bruce and Grayson who tell Barbara, it's like, well, you're welcome to stay here with us until you can get on your feet or whatever for the break. We have Alfred who mentions, like, well, we do get rather busy here, Master Wayne. It's like, well, no, like, she's family, and like, we could just have her here. Like, what's the problem with that? So that is all resolved. So we have Bruce, who is to go to Wayne Enterprises to put a big, huge telescope up for eventually this to have some point of being here, which eventually it does. We have Bruce mentioning some story about his father, mentioning uh, about some kind of story about him looking up at the stars, hence why he made this massive telescope invention, or this massive telescope being propped here. I don't think it's actually Wayne Enterprises, but it's like maybe like a wing or something. I don't know. I don't know the actual layout of whatever. So we have Bruce and we have Julie, that is, of course, there. And of course, we have one reporter that I think had been in Batman Returns, and now she's also in. She was also in Batman Forever. Now she's actually in this film. She's like the Phil Coulson of all of these movies. Like, almost like from Batman Returns on. Like, I think she might have been in every single one of these movies. Who knows? But she's a reporter who is to ask Bruce. It's like, well, seems like you and Julie have been an item for a while. When exactly are you going to tie the knot? And Bruce is like, well, looking at Julie, it's like, well, can you help me here? And Julie's like, well, like we've been recklessly in love, but I think that's good enough for us. To where like Bruce is turning to Julie and he's like, well, like good save. Like thanks for that. I guess you're good for something after all. So we push on to have Pamela Eisley running into Bruce to tell her it's like, well, like we need to do something for the plant life. It's like forget about the skies. It's like we need to do something for our land, like our seas and everything like that. Like we've overly polluted it and all kinds of things. So we have Pamela Eisley who is to propose this thing to Bruce, and Bruce is like saying, well, like if anything, like there's not going to be enough food and there's not going to be enough heat for everybody. So I'm sorry, it's like we would kill so many people trying to do what you want done. And so we have it where Pamela's like, well, it's a battle to save the planet. And Bruce is like, well, yeah, that sounds all great and good and all, but we have it to where really Pamela is talking about how the people are like poisoning the seas and darkening their skies and all kinds of stuff. You're killing her. You're killing Mother Nature. So we have Bruce who ends up giving Pamela a invitation to go to some banquet as a charity fundraiser for plants and animals to try and like make amends for not thinking of these people. But unfortunately, Bruce Wayne has so many charity things going on, so many charity balls, that eventually that would connect with the one thing that Poison Ivy would have talked about. So, ergo, that's what ends up happening. So, we have it to where since Bruce Wayne and Robin realize that it seems that Mr. Freeze is really into diamonds, we end up having Bruce Wayne decide to get the biggest diamond that he quite possibly has to be put to this this banquet, this charity thing, this auction of sorts, as well as them bidding on some of the women that are there that is to be represented as flowers. Coincidence? I think not. So we push on to have Batman and Robin, who are to be appearing at this banquet because they know that this will sucker Mr. Freeze in. So they're like, well, yeah, like we got to be like in our suits to be here. And surefire enough, instead of actually Mr. Freeze appearing, we have at first Poison Ivy appearing in bizarrely coming down to this nice little Congo line to where we have Poison Ivy coming to this dance number to where all these like basically half naked men are all going and like throwing down onto the floor so that way she could walk over them consistently to where eventually she ends up getting like basically carried onto the stage, and both Robin and Batman grab onto her so that way she won't fall over, so on and so forth. So we have Poison Ivy, who of course uses her pheromone dust. And so we have it to where Poison Ivy is to mention that you will see every single thing that you see here, and plus everything you don't. So we end up having a lot of people who, of course, got the pheromone dust blast of Poison Ivy, and so they are throwing all kinds of money at Poison Ivy, as well as Poison Ivy wearing this necklace. So we have, of course, both Batman and Robin who are now trying to win Poison Ivy's affection as well, to the point of reasonably Robin is is kind of waging more money than actually he does not have, but he's gonna borrow it from Bruce, and Bruce is outbidding basically himself. To where eventually we have Batman who ends up jockeying out his Batman credit card, where don't leave the K without it, bizarrely. I guess it's some commercial that I guess they were trying to pull off in this movie. So we have it to where Poison Ivy's dimension is like, you two boys are fighting over little old me. To where eventually we have Mr. Freeze who ends up coming along and busting up this whole auction to steal the necklace away from Plant Girl, Vine Lady. We eventually have Batman and Robin who are to be stuck fighting uh, Mr. Freeze's goons to to eventually have Mr. Freeze going and talking to Poison Ivy. We have Poison Ivy who ends up trying to use her dust like pheromones on Mr. Freeze, and he's like, "Well, sorry, like this would heat a man's blood, but it doesn't work on the cold-hearted." So we have it to where, of course, Ivy gives Mr. Freeze the diamond, and so here's the thing: this diamond is red. All the other diamonds are white. Wouldn't you have thought that eventually we would see Mr. Freeze eventually having one standout diamond that was red? Because obviously that diamond was red. But maybe he changed the color of it. Maybe he painted it silver. I don't know. But that just kind of bugged me in this movie. Uh, so we go on to here's the thing. I forgot about Poison Ivy getting her new headquarters. So Poison Ivy ends up finding this place, and it's filled with some neon gang members, which of course Bane just completely and utterly annihilates. We have Poison Ivy who ends up redesigning her headquarters, and Bane ends up uh, stomping the floor to where Poison Ivy is to place plants into her hideout. That is, I guess, barely an interesting thing. But anyways, so we have. I think shortly thereafter this, we end up having the chase out sequence, uh, where I want to say we have the chase out sequence. So we have it to where, of course, Mr. Freeze ends up getting the diamond, and we end up having this car chase of Batman and his Batmobile, Robin and his motorcycle, chasing after Mr. Freeze. And so we eventually have this little like statue kind of swamp where Mr. Freeze is eventually trying to speed as much as possible to get from this statue onto some building, some rooftop building. And so we eventually have Batman realize that Robin isn't going to make it, but Batman will. And Robin is like, dude, I can make it. And so we have Batman who ends up disconnecting Robin's engines. And so Robin ends up going for a pretty decent time sliding down this building while Batman is to make it, but Robin is stuck at this statue. So we have Batman who ends up making it to this building, and two of Mr. Freeze's thugs via their vehicles don't make it. So we end up having seemingly Mr. Freeze going and freezing up the entire Batmobile, and Mr. Freeze is to naturally assume that, oh, well, like, Batman's now dead, or Batman can't get out of the Batmobile because it's frozen. Well, we have Batman who ends up ejecting out of the Batmobile to fly onto Mr. Freeze's vehicle, and of course we end up having Mr. Freeze going, uh-oh, weirdly enough. We end up seeing Batman who ends up removing his cape from a scene to show that he had collected Mr. Freeze. So we end up having Bruce and Robin, or Bruce and Grayson butting heads in the Batmobile. We have it to where reasonably Robin is mentioning how like he's kind of sick of Bruce and how like it really is like his way or the highway, and that Bruce couldn't stand it. That it seems that Poison Ivy wanted Dick instead of him, and like this kind of like repeats numerous times over. So, but we end up having Dick who's mentioning it's like, well, like you're really pig-headed in that, uh, like since it's your place, it's your rules, and Wayne and Bruce is like, well, yeah, it is my place, and so we eventually go on to have eventually Bruce going and seeing Alfred and kind of seeing like how he is, and we have it to where Alfred is congratulating Bruce on getting to Mister Freeze, but we eventually have Bruce who's asking Alfred, it's like, well, is it really my way or the highway? And we have it to where Alfred is like, well, yeah, like if anything, like things have to be done the way you want them to because you're so like overprotective of everything, to where like nobody could actually really do like what they want. It's basically like you're going to push them into doing what you want instead of like how they want, or just like nobody else is going to have a decision in here but Bruce. So so we push on. So uh we eventually have it to where uh really both Dick and Bruce are kind of fantasizing about Poison Ivy so often. We have Dick who is to get a newspaper article of Poison Ivy and say, who the heck is this girl? We have it to where Bruce is going and spending some time uh, with his girl. I've already forgotten the name. Julie. We end up having Bruce spending some time with Julie, and the whole entire time he's fantasizing about Ivy, to the point to where Julie is to ask Bruce, it's like, well, who's Ivy? And he's like, I don't know. It's like, you just called me Ivy, you motherfucker. I'm leaving you. I'm leaving you. Because we have it to where Julie is confirming with Bruce that uh, the relationship between them is completely fine the way it is, even though some people would feel differently, uh, and just trying to like calm Bruce's nerves. But so yeah, really that scene plays out to where eventually Bruce calls out another name while kissing Julie. So I guess they broke up just then and there. So we push on, and so we have Grayson who is looking at the newspaper article of Ivy saying, who's that girl? And we also have Grayson who is also looking into the camera footage to see if anybody is entering in a place that they shouldn't. We end up having Barbara who is to go and do a thing called stealing a motorcycle, and we have Grayson who is to take a motorcycle to go and find out what Barbara is doing. So we have Barbara who goes on to, I guess, bet on herself, and at this very interesting looking night motorcycle race place. Funny enough, here's the thing. So we have like these visuals of these graffiti going on in the background to, of course, showcase Robin, but it looks very like goofy-ish. To where I'm just like, oh, okay, so is this just kind of saying that Robin is eventually going to be in this part of this movie somewhere? Because why do they have two things looking just like Robin in this scenario? It's bizarre. Uh, so we have Barbara who is talking to some motorcycle guy named Spike, and it seems like he is really trying to intimidate Barbara. That I think she had won a race before, but she won't win a race again, and so we have it to where it seems that Spike is going to pull off some kind of maneuver towards the tail end of this race to eventually probably kill some people off. So we go on, and so we have this race, and so it seems that both Barbara and Grayson, and man, do I really love the helmet that Grayson has in this movie. Like, I remember in Batman Forever, where like he had that one kind of helmet, and they kind of went back to that same design in this movie, which I actually really do like. Plus, it also had to like really cover uh, Grayson's entire head, so it kind of like works perfectly for the mystery of it all. So we have Barbara and Grayson making it through this race, and so they are, of course, in the lead. So we end up having Spike's clowns, or whatever they are, go and toss some flames onto the end of this track. And so we have both Barbara and Grayson not realizing this, and so they end up trying to stop, and they end up having Spike saying like, "Well, hey, like, sayonara, girl." So we have Barbara and Grayson sliding, and we eventually have Grayson grabbing onto Barbara, and Barbara almost slides completely off, but Grayson has one leg on some pipe to where it perfectly goes on to Grayson grabbing onto Barbara to perfectly be able to save them both. So we have Barbara who ends up taking off her helmet, and we end up having Grayson who takes off his to be like, "Oh, so this is what you're doing nights and doing at nights." And Barbara's like, like, yeah. So, uh, let me pause here for a second. Let me reset a little bit. Kind of love these little like resets that I get, because I'm like, it gets to the point where I go like so long like talking about an entire movie that I'm like, you know what, like, I need to one adjust myself into a chair, but also I need to take a second to just like reboot my noggin, because I'm like halfway almost through the film, so I want to get to like a point where I can just like, okay, like all that knowledge is now gone, let's get to this point. So we push on, so we have to go and do the Mr. Freeze prison stuff. So we have, of course, who Mr. Freeze is now in a refrigerator, making his way to his cell. So we have it to where Mr. Freeze is to try to get out of his cell to escape and beat down these two guards, but Mr. Freeze is to not be able to get really far because he needs to be stuck into a thing called the froze zone, because it's kind of like a light that goes down onto Mr. Freeze, which keeps him cool. Because of course he can't just get into a freezer and get out of here. Like, he can't do that. So we eventually have Mr. Freeze, who ends up going and taking a clock and taking some piece of ice and chiseling out a ice sculpt that looks just like Nora, and Mr. Freeze is looking over it. So we have it to where Mr. Freeze is to be told that it seems like his sister had come to see him. I'm like, wouldn't he have gone out to like get to some phone thing where he is to like talk to her, instead of like Poison Ivy just coming to his room? That seems a little goofy, but I guess story wise, I guess it makes sense. So we have Poison Ivy, who is to kiss both of these guards after using her pheromones. And we have Poison Ivy, who is to tell Mr. Freeze the plan that they're going to try to bust him out of here. So we have Bane, who ends up breaking through into Arkham to get Mr. Freeze's outfits, while we also see a ton of other outfits of other villains that had happened in previous movies. Some kind of Easter eggs, some cool things that we get to see. So we have Bane running through this prison, bashing through all these guards, and having all of Mr. Freeze's gear, attire, whatever. So we have Bane who arrives to have, of course, Mr. Freeze say, a laundry service that delivers. Wow. So we have, of course, Mr. Freeze who ends up getting all of his attire on, but he doesn't have his diamonds to be able uh, to really perform all that well in this suit. So we have it to where with Mr. Freeze's minimal power, they're trying to figure out how a way to get out of here because Bane can't bash through this wall because it's reinforced steel. So we have Mr. Freeze who ends up freezing the pipes, and that is to explode the wall of which to get them out of here. So all of them end up jumping into the water down below to uh, to escape. So pushing on, so we end up having Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy, and Bane needing to go back to Mr. Freeze's headquarters to get his diamonds and to also get all the stuff that he needs for his experiment that he's going to do after this. So we also end up coincidentally at the same time we have Batman and Robin who are to find Mr. Freeze's ice cream uh, headquarters or hideout. So we have it to where Batman and Robin are going on to talk about, or going on to talk to Commissioner Gordon about Mr. Freeze's hideout and whatever. But eventually, we have also Robin and Batman like talking about like how silly it was that they were fighting over like a bad guy and and Batman was like, bad, yes. Guy, no. But they end up also talking about her stems and her buds or whatever. I guess a very kind of cryptic thing about talking about how attractive, I guess, Poison Ivy was. So we go on and we have Batman who ends up finding Mr. Freeze's secret room to where they are to see Nora's body seemingly displayed in some kind of uh, snow globe like fashion. So we have Batman who ends up noticing there's some panel where he's to see that it seems that Mr. Freeze is trying to figure out how to cure Nora's illness, and it seems like there are some early stages that have been cured. I wonder who's probably going to need this medication to be cured by the end of this. I wonder who the person is ill in this movie that it hurts every time I see Alfred just in pain in this movie. But I don't think that's going to be the same thing, right? That couldn't, like, we have it to where Nora can't have the exact same illness as Alfred, and Dr. or Mr. Freeze had figured out the cure for an early stage of quite possibly what could be Alfred's illness, right? What a coinkydink. So we have it to where Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze is watching on, seeing Batman and Robin being at Mr. Freeze's headquarters. And so we have Mr. Freeze who's like, well, like, in my weakened condition, I won't be able to fight the Bat and Bird. And Poison Ivy's like, well, no, that'll be fine. Like, if anything, like, I can take care of them. So we have Mr. Freeze who ends up going and basically beating down all of these police officers by putting like pushing some lever from heat to cold. So now all these like police guards are not only cold, but then they have to like fight Mr. Freeze in his perfect environment. So we have Mr. Freeze who ends up getting all of his stuff and getting the heck out of here. So we have Poison Ivy who is to eventually have Bane fight out Batman and Robin. And so we have also Poison Ivy using her dust to try and get either Batman or Robin to kiss her, and we have Batman who is kind of very level-headed between the two of them, to where Batman is like, no, like I've heard reports about her having a poison kiss. Like, no, like do not try to kiss her, no matter how tempting it is. So we eventually have Bane who ends up tossing Batman off to the side, and so we end up having Poison Ivy spraying her dust into Batman yet again, and we have Poison Ivy getting close to kissing Batman. He's like, "Oh no! Like I'm not gonna fall for that." Like, and so we have it to where obviously Bruce is going to try and arrest Poison Ivy because he knows good and well that it seems like every single time uh, there is some kind of something that is forcing either Batman or Robin uh, to butt heads over her. So we have eventually Robin who ends up getting dumped into this ice cream, and we eventually have Bane who is to end up grabbing onto Batman because Poison Ivy says, "Well, that's I'm a lover, not a fighter. That's why every Poison Ivy action figure comes complete with Bane." I guess again being another merchandising ploy to just be like, well, like we gotta really push some commercials with this movie. So we eventually have it to where Bane and of course Poison Ivy eventually get out of here because eventually Batman has to go and save Robin from being dumped in this ice cream, and we have Commissioner Gordon is like, "How did they get away?" He's like, "Sorry, it's like I was trying to help Robin out of this ice cream." And so we have Robin who is yet again angry with Bruce because like, "You just can't stand it because she liked me more than you. You just couldn't stand it." So so we push on. So because we eventually have Poison Ivy that is trying to tell, or was trying to tell Robin that he deserves a light in the sky, and that uh, Robin no longer needs the big bad bat. And so we eventually have it to where Poison Ivy is going into uh, this get together that Bruce is having with all these people, this party, and so we have Poison Ivy who is going and blowing feminine dust into Commissioner Gordon to get keys for the Batlight, to where we have Poison Ivy who is going and having Bane go and take out this light, which I was like, you know, wouldn't that have lighted, like, couldn't you have gotten any other light? Why does it exactly have to be the Batman light? Couldn't they have found any, like, light that, like it had to be the Batman signal light? You couldn't have found any other light besides that, and, like, the one where you didn't have to, like, clean off the Bat signal to replace with the Robin signal? So pushing on, so we eventually have because we eventually had Barbara who is to tell Dick after their whole night riding that that Alfred is sick, but eventually Bruce says that no, Alfred is dying, and Barbara is to mention to Dick that there's no way that Alfred could actually be happy here, and Grayson is trying to debate that and is like, no, like Bruce and Alfred are family, and like Barbara mentions like all the stuff that Alfred has to do, and it's like, well, yeah, but like somebody has to do it. So we have Barbara who is to go to Alfred and to tuck him in, and Alfred's like, you came to tuck me in, quite a switch. So we have it to where eventually Alfred is trying to find some other family member of his to give him some discs, some information. And supposedly this guy is in India somewhere, and it's kind of hard to be able to find a way to get to him because evidently they don't make or fax machines strapped onto elephants, I guess. So we have it to where Alfred, considering his weakened condition, he ends up giving this disc to Barbara. And so Barbara is like, well, like, you know what, I'm family. You know what, I want to figure out what this whole thing is. Like, I want to figure out what's going on with this whole situation. So we have Barbara who ends up going, and eventually, after numerous passwords that seemingly don't work, like have Barbara's like, man, this password, there's got to be something really secret in here. So we eventually have it to where Barbara is looking at some photo of Alfred's at one point in this movie, and Alfred is to mention that a nickname that he was given was called Peg, a name for a nickname from Sweet Margaret. So we have Barbara who ends up putting Peg in. That works. And so we have Barbara who ends up finding out everything going on with both Batman and Robin. To eventually we end up having the every single like image of whatever going on to like Barbara's face. It looks interesting. Like it like was projected onto her face bizarrely. And eventually we end up having the Batman and Robin signal or symbol like fused together. Like, I don't feel like that part is like really actually important, but I guess it's just like, well, we just needed generic images at this point. So we have it to where Barbara is like, oh, okay, well, I guess I figured out where the Batcave is, and so I'm going to sneak in here and just become Batwoman, because we have Alfred who is to come on as intruder alert, because I guess uh, really if that wasn't annoying in Batman Forever, they kind of toned it down a little bit, so that way it's not as annoying as in the original intruder alert kind of thing where Jim Carrey's like, true alert, shut up. So pushing on. So we have a tour. Barbara's like, hey, Alfred, I'm in the Batcave. And Alfred is like, well, like, I kind of figured that eventually you would stumble upon this. So I made like a contingency plan to find a suit for you to wear. So we end up having, of course, Barbara turning into Batgirl. So we are to eventually push on to eventually have Robin see that there is a Robin signal in the sky queuing up to tell Robin that Poison Ivy wants him. And so we have it to where Batman is to try to convince Grayson that it's like, hey, you know what? Like, let's really just stop for a moment and really think this through. Like, if anything, we have it to where Robin is consistently saying that he needs to go on his own. And we have Bruce is like, well, like, remember, like, someone used to tell me that you need to rely on someone else to win and stuff like that. Like, kind of throwing back to, I think, Batman Forever. And so we really have it to where Bruce is telling Grayson, it's like, wait a minute. It's like, if anything, like, let's think this through. Let's come up with a plan before we go and rush into all this. Like, if anything, like help me, help you, and like help one another, and try to go into this rationally. Like, if anything, friend, partner, brother, like, will you help me? Like, will you help me? Like, do this the right way. And Grayson's like, okay. So we go on to have Grayson, or we end up having Robin go off to greet Poison Ivy to try and get her plans of what Mr. Freeze is to do, because Mr. Freeze has a wing into Poison Ivy's headquarters, and he is to mention what his plan is, that he's going to use the big telescope to freeze all of Gotham. So we have Robin who's going to Ivy to see, because he doesn't know these plans, so he's going to Ivy to try to figure out what is going on. So we have Grayson who is of course trying to get very like romantic with Ivy, trying to have her confess what the plans are. And so we have Poison Ivy who's like, well, I'll tell you and then I'll kiss you. No, you'll kiss me and then you tell me, kind of. So we have it to where Poison Ivy eventually tells uh, Mr. Freeze's whole plan, and so we have Robin who kisses Poison Ivy, and so we have Poison Ivy who's like, well, bad news, I'm afraid. Time to die, little Robin. And we have Robin who's like, well, I hate to break it to you, but rubber lips are immune to your charms, and so we end up having him like peel off the rubber from these lips, and so we have like Poison Ivy's like, ah, like crap. So we have Ivy who ends up trapping Robin into some plant. We have Ivy who thinks she's trying to like skirt away from Robin, but Batman ends up coming in and appearing. So we have Ivy who ends up mentioning to Batman, it's like, well, my vines have a crush on you. And so we have Batman who just starts to get like hung up by all these vines, and he has to go and get from his bat belt some little saw or chainsaw like thing that ends up kind of cutting through these vines. So we have it to where Ivy thinks like, oh, she's in the clear, and then we end up having Barbara as Batgirl popping in, and so we have Barbara who's like, yeah, using your feminine wilds to like to get through your crimes, is like, lady, that went a long time ago, and all kinds of this gobbledygook. So we eventually have Ivy and Barbara fighting it out. We have it to where Ivy confesses that she had told Lady Freeze that this is a one-woman show, and she said that she pulled the plug of Nora, because Ivy had told Mr. Freeze that Batman had deactivated her, and Mr. Freeze would say, "You lied," and it's like no, like if anything, it's true, which is actually a lie. So we eventually have it to where Barbara eventually goes on to just start beating the crap out of Ivy, to where eventually she also gets sucked into one of her plants and then trapped. So we are to push on to eventually have Batman, Batgirl, and Robin make their way to the environment of which that Mr. Freeze is in. They end up driving on all kinds of now modified winter vehicles. I think we have Batgirl, who is now driving a motorcycle. We have bizarrely Robin, who is like driving in some like bizarrish God, what is it, like a snowmobile or a snow whatever, like a snow I don't know what it's called exactly. And we have Batman, who is on like the Batwing, but it's like down to the ground to where he's not flying in the sky. He's just kind of like going through, and eventually we have one of the we end up having one of the goons trying to use the ice ray on Batman's Batwing, but we have Batman who brings up a shield to it to flex onto the Mr. Freeze's goon's vehicle instead. So kind of like saying like, haha, we're not going to be able to like have this happen yet again to us. So we have Mr. Freeze and Bane who are going on to have Mr. Freeze mention it's like, well, it really is the size of your gun. So we have it to where Bane is plopping all kinds of bombs around this telescope, and we have Mr. Freeze who is putting together his experiment to eventually freeze Gotham. So we have eventually this device that is all going on that is starting to freeze Gotham. We have it to where uh, all Gotham is now frozen with the exclusion of Batman, Robin, and Batgirl because they have made it onto the place of where Mr. Freeze is at. So we go on and we have seemingly Mr. Freeze and Bane now gone. So we have uh, all three of the Bat family going and trying to figure out how to reverse this process to unfreeze Gotham. We have Batman who tosses some thawers out to two of the scientists, and Batgirl's like, well, hopefully you have like 10 million of those things, those little toys. So we have Batman who is trying to reposition some satellites and have this uh, and have this uh, telescope go and instead of being a freezing gun, being a heating gun instead. And so the only problem is that there are two things that they need to be able to dethaw this dethaw onto this telescope. And so we have both Robin and Barbara going and doing that. And so we have Mr. Freeze who ends up coming behind Batman and starting to fight between them. We have Mr. Freeze jockeying the telescope so much to where Barbara and Dick fall over. And we have at first Robin grabbing onto Batgirl, shooting the thing out to like, yeah, I gotcha. That doesn't work. So we have eventually Barbara who ends up shooting out her thing, and her thing actually works perfectly well. And she's like, no, I got you. Kind of reminiscent to the Batman and Batman Forever scene where Batman dives to grab Robin and saves him at the last minute. So Barbara and Robin come back onto the to the telescope. So we have Batman and Robin, or we have Batman and Mister Freeze that are fighting it out. Like it looks very much like a boxing match. It looks really fun, and so we end up having both scientists who eventually are to jump onto this telescope and hold on because reasonably they are to uh, accidentally have this telescope go all over the place to where they eventually have to jump onto it and hold on. So we eventually have seemingly Batman eventually getting the better of Mr. Freeze, tossing a Thar thing, a little toy onto Mr. Freeze's chest and telling him the heat is on, knocking him over, and eventually we have Mr. Freeze who ends up falling onto his diamonds, and the centerpiece of his diamond thing eventually falls through. And so we have, of course, Mr. Freeze who is a bitter loser, and so we have Mr. Freeze is like, well, that's not all. We have Batman who is trying to thaw the city with repositioning these satellites and whichever. And it starts to work, but then Mr. Freeze blows up the telescope. Batman is to go into excuse me. Batman is to run and go and try to retrieve the scientists. And so we eventually have them forcibly try and figure out to, via these satellites, try and unthaw Gotham by doing these satellites and try to like do it that way and try to use some like reflective things to try and unthaw Gotham, which of course they do. So we end up having, of course, Batman, Robin, and Batgirl still winning at the end of this, anyways. So we finally have Batman going to Mr. Freeze and like, yeah, hey, you did lose, but you know what? Like, when Robin and Batgirl were to get back up, they had to immediately fight out Bane. They had to both go together and kick off his like back like tubes and stuff, which was like a very flimsy like thing to where of course like I think that whole way of defeating Bane, like that set up for like years to come of like, oh, okay, well, here's how to defeat Bane. Just take all these tubes and all this crap from out of the back of his head. I don't know how many numerous Batman Arkham games that was the exact way of defeating Bane for a number of years. Like, good God, how many times would you have to defeat Bane by just taking whatever tubes and whatever from out of him and done deal, he's defeated. To where eventually I think they had to like go away with the whole tube thing to just make it to where like, well, you really had to really take down Bane in a very creative way in some other kind of animated things. So anyways, we go on to have Batman talking to Mr. Freeze and saying, hey, like, if anything, I am going to help you. Like, yeah, you're going to go to prison and you're going to go to prison for a long time, but you know what? I'm going to help you save a life. I'm going to go and help and fund you to cure your wife. Because also, I need you to give me the cure of an early stage of McGregor syndrome and stage 1. So if you help me with that, I will help you cure your wife. Like, I will give you endless funding, whatever you need to do to cure your wife, I will help you. I will get you whatever you need. So we have Mr. Freeze who ends up giving we end up having Mr. Freeze giving Batman the cure for Alfred. So we have Alfred who is to get the cure, and he's feeling perfectly fine. And so we have it to where eventually Poison Ivy is in prison, plucking out flowers saying, she loves me, or he loves me not, he loves me. And eventually we have Mr. Freeze saying, loves me not. So we have Mr. Freeze, who is going to be a permanent cellmate of Poison Ivy's to make her life a living hell. And so, like, that's basically how this movie eventually goes on to end. Just kind of a happy ending for everybody, and I think that's exactly the way the movie ends. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.